and welcome back for another CottageCutz YouTube video tutorial. This is Marla and I'm so glad you're joining me today. I have this card featuring a die that was made for a Slimline card, but we're going to change the direction and use it for an A2 card. Here is a look at that die. It is called the Mountain and Trees Slimline. I always talk about how important it is to me to be able to get as much use out of my dies as I possibly can. And using slimline dies on A2 size cards, especially scene building dies, really works well. So we have the snow, we have the mountains, and then we have the tree line. So I'm showing you the mountains right there, and then there's a look at the tree line. You see that I do have an A2 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of cardstock right there. And then here's a look at the snow. I am not going to be using the snow today for my card. I'm creating more of a summer scene. But let's jump in and talk about placement. So I mentioned that this is an A2 size card. I want to make sure that I have enough room when I'm doing my die cutting for me to have a sky. I'm going to be using foam tape in between each of my layers. I like dimension on my cards. So I have placed my die where I want it on my A2 panel. This is just accent opaque cardstock, and I am going to run it through my die cutting machine. Once I finish running it through my die cutting machine, then I will have my pattern. So right there, I want to see where I want my trees to lie. I want to keep that panel solid, so I'm going to bring in another piece of cardstock, again cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, and I'm going to run this through my die cutting machine. I want to do a little bit of ink blending. Instead of going with brown or gray mountains, I am going to do a cast shadow with some purples. So I'm starting with milled lavender, and I'm going to add that milled lavender very strategically on the panel. I don't need to use all of the ink down towards the bottom, so I'm going to just save that ink blending by adding a heavy layer to the top. Probably it looks like it's about a half. You see that I'm adding those trees to make sure that I'm getting the coverage to the height that I need. And once I get this finished, I am going to bring in some Dusty Concord and a very small blending brush. Now, I shared these blending brushes in my last video along with the link, so if you want to go back to that video, you can, and you'll be able to find where I purchased them on Amazon. I use these blending brushes to get into small places, and I'm using that Dusty Concord and the side of my blending brush to add some depth to these mountains. So when you look at the mountains, you always see different crevices and there's separations in each of the crags, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm using that Dusty Concord, which is a little bit darker than that milled lavender, to add those valleys, to add shadow to the left side of the mountaintop. And once I get all of the shadowing in place the way that I like it, I'll go over it one more time with the milled lavender, making sure that it just kind of softens those areas where I added that darker ink. And you'll see once I bring in those trees that it really is going to make a significant difference. It looks a little bit funny here, but when the scene is all put together, it really does add dimension to the piece. And now we're going to move on to our trees. So I do have the blending where I want them. I'm going to start by blending the trees with pine needles. And I'm not going to do any shading with this. I'm just going to separate the trees from the grass. So I'm starting with the pine needles, and then I'm going to add I think it's mowed lawn, maybe it's rustic wilderness to the bottom. You should be able to see rustic wilderness to the bottom of this panel, and I'll blend both of those together, and that's just going to just add a little bit more dimension to the trees, separate things out a little bit. I did want to mention in my last video that I was giving away the Leafy Branch die. I did that beautiful wreath with that die, and the winner of that Leafy Branch die is Dawn Haddad 7636. Her name is on the screen. Dawn, I'll have Mary's information linked in the description box below. below. You can contact her and let her know that you are the winner of that leafy die, and she'll get it sent out to you. We're moving on to our background panel. You'll see that I'm back with a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of cardstock. I wanted to add a little bit of purple to the sky, and I'm going to really need to work at this because for whatever reason, I just wasn't getting the blend that I wanted. I started with Mermaid Lagoon, and then I went in with that Dusty Concord, which I thought would cast that shadow in those mountains, but it's not blended as well as I would like for it to be. So I am just going to set it aside for just a moment. I'm letting that ink sit into the paper, and once I let that ink sit, I'll add a little bit of water to all 3 of the panels. And you'll see I'll get that water distressed look over the top of each of them. I really like that look. I'll make sure to dry each of the panels, and then I'll bring that milled lavender. I think it's the milled, yes, the milled lavender back in. Nope, it's a little bit of that Dusty Concord, sorry. I'm adding the Dusty Concord back in, and you'll notice that I'm going over some of those blue areas, which is going to give a darker shade. It's going to give more of a casted shadow. I'll blend it out one more time with the Mermaid Lagoon. Even though I did those water splatters, they're still going to show up. It's just going to be a little bit different of a color. I like the way that that blended together, so I'm going to move on to my deer. I wanted to say moose, deer. I've been spending time with my granddaughter this week, and she has this adorable little moose that she plays with. So I kind of have a little bit of a moose on my mind. But this is a deer. I'm starting with some antique linen, and this comes from a Christmas die from the 2021 collection. I think it's still available, and I'll link it in the description box below. But I'm going to add a little bit of gathered twigs to the antlers, add a little bit of shadowing to the body, giving it that buffed look. I'll bring in some vintage photo, and we're going to add a little bit more depth and blend this out. So going back to the scene, the die is really great if you like to make slimline cards, but if you're not a slimline card maker, I always say don't discount some of the slimline dies that are out there. Take a look at them. CottageCutz always has really great sales, and sometimes the price point on these slimline dies are just too hard to pass up. So if you look at them, just if you've watched some videos where people share how they use their slimline dies like I have on an A2 size card, you can get more use out of them, and you can use them throughout your card making even if you aren't a slimline card maker. I'm adding just a little bit more of a touch of that vintage photo, and then I have this Copic pen that I'm going to add some black to the hooves, and I'm also going to add it to the nose. I added a little bit of Victorian velvet to the ears of my deer. So here's where we're going to start layering. Now I messed up this layer. I'm going to say that straight up. I could not get it straight for the life of me. It just wasn't aligning right, and I had to pull it off a couple of times. So I am going to tear it off, add a little bit more wet glue, try it again, and when it doesn't work, I'm finally going to go to my nifty trick that I should have done from the very beginning, and that is to bring in my Misty. You can do this with a scoreboard as well. I'll align the back panel in the corner, and then I will line up the back panel the front panel that way. You notice that I did add foam tape. That's going to add dimension to the card. It's also going to add more depth to my scene. I need to stamp my sentiments, so I am going to add some anti-static powder to my top layer, which is going to be the grass and the trees. And then I will use some Versamark ink to ink my sentiment that says happy birthday. Once I get that inked, I'll use some gold embossing powder over the top of that, and I'll use my heat tool to set the sentiment. Here we go. I always love the magic of embossing. I did have a couple of strays, so if you do have that, having a small paintbrush really does help to just kind of brush some of those things away. Again, we're going to add some more foam tape. This time I'm adding some foam tape that's a 1/4 inch foam tape. I want to be able to add it to each of the trees, making sure that if I were to send this through the mail, that those trees wouldn't get a bend in them going through the postage meter. If you've ever wondered how dimensional cards get sent and not damaged, one of the tricks that I use is I always place my raised panels towards the back so that the flat back of my card is the part that's going to be running through the postage meter, where they're actually going to be stamping on top of it. So that's a little trick if you're sending out dimensional cards, to make sure that they just don't get all bent up. It really works for me. I've never had anybody complain that their card fell apart when it was coming through the mail. So I think that that's a really good piece of advice that I could give you when sending out some dimensional or cards that have sequins and things like that on them. Just place it towards the back instead of putting it face first. All right, we have it. We have our card panel in our Misty, and look at how beautiful that comes together. We have the beautiful vibrant colors from the sky. We added that purple to the bottom of it, which is going to cast a shadow on our mountains. I'm going to mount this onto an A2 top folding card base from Nina Desert Storm cardstock. Once I do that, I'm going to add my deer, and that will complete my card for today. I did want to quickly mention that if you are not on the Scrap and Cottage email list, you might want to get on that list. We have a couple of releases that are coming out in a very, very short while, and I want to make sure that you don't miss any of those. Hopefully, I'll be able to bring you some of those new products in my next video, but until next time, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you. Until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day.